So I was delivering some training this week, the Oliver McGowan Mandatory Training on Learning Disabilities and Autism, Tier 2, so the full day session, and I was the expert by experience, or the co-trainer for autism in the afternoon, delivering training with a colleague who's very good, and this was to a social care setting. So it's a private supplier of domiciliary care services to the public sector, so children and adults. So the people kind of recruited by these private organisations, they still have to comply with the legislation that local authorities have to apply with, a lot of public sector services have to apply with, including the Equality Act, etc, etc. And this has come up a couple of times before, and that with regards to restraint. Now, everybody will probably have a view on this. I personally have a view on this, having sort of like done many different roles over the years, and as well as being late diagnosed autistic, ADHD, and myself. But the services I've worked with in the past, we've always endeavoured to do everything possible in terms of like gathering information about people we supported, you know, finding their sort of like preferred ways of doing things, communication, etc, etc, and to avoid the need for restraint. However, I have seen as a commissioner that a lot of services, perhaps that's the go-to, and it becomes embedded within their culture, you know, and I've seen that in many ways. That's quite unpleasant. Two things came up: applied behaviour analysis and positive behavioural support. Now, interestingly enough, BILD, the journal for positive behavioural support, actually said in State of the Nation report a couple of years ago that PBS should not categorically be used for neurodivergent people who aren't or don't have learning disabilities, right? And that includes many people. So I kind of made this point throughout the thing. Anyway, towards the end of the session, as we were wrapping up, I said, you know, the studies are out there. It's proven that many forms of these restraint practices have actually really detrimental effects, long-term detrimental effects, and sometimes life-limiting detrimental effects on the people who sort of have experienced them through no choice of their own. And this guy comes up to me and he says, okay, so you know, thank you for the presentation. I said, what would you do, he said, rather, if you have a child who, you know, who doesn't do something, and you'd want to, how would you force a child to do something? And I'm like, okay, how would you force a child to do something? And I said, you might need to explain a bit more. So he said, how would you force a child to do something that's good for them that they don't want to do? So I said, can you give me an example? He said, well, okay, I'm supporting this child, but all they want to do is kind of play games inside, and I think they should go to the park. I said, well, you know, for one, you got to think about your role. You're there, you're not a parent. You know, you're there to provide a function. You're being paid for that function. You have to carry out that professionally, as well as thinking about, you got to think about this child in their own right, and they have choice and control over what they want to do in their lives, right? It's not like you know, they've done a crime and they have to serve a sentence. And he said, yeah, I know, but it's like all they want to do is sit inside playing games. I said, well, what's wrong with that? It's their choice, right? It's their choice, and you're trying to get them to do something else. I said, yeah, but how would you force them to do something which you know is good for you? I said, look, listen, don't do it, right? You're trying to force them to do something. There may be many reasons why they don't want to do that. It might be you, it might be the thing, it could be a whole number of things which you don't know about, and you think you've got an idea of it. And they keep going on and say, well, you know, and I said, like, it's not even like you're a parent, okay? So think about it from a parent's perspective. If you have a child who's, due to their sensory sensitivities and everything else, or their diet, everything else, they might not eat as many vegetables as they should. Now, as a parent, you've probably got a bit more latitude in terms of introducing things. But I said to him, if you want to introduce new activities, give them choice and control, give them agency, give them autonomy, present sort of like a way to kind of see different things going on, and then let them choose. You know, you can introduce things in a very non-threatening way. But I said to him, absolutely do not force this person, and they just didn't get it. And as an autistic person myself, you know, we are oftentimes labelled as being rigid. Rigidity of thought was the old diagnostic criteria. But it really saddened me to see that despite having done the e-learning, despite having done the webinar, despite having just done the full two-day tier 2 full day training on learning disability and autism, this person who could potentially go out and support a young person and take that rigid mindset, that way, going against all of the ethics that we've spoken about throughout the day, about listening to me and everything else, just didn't get it. And that's the reality I think we see for many people in the sector. So this post is a few days afterwards, but still, you know, it deeply upset me to see that people are still not being listened to in that sense. And listening to is not necessarily just spoken words, it's all manner of communication. But absolutely, you know, I said to them, do not force that kid to do something which you think is right, because you're going to traumatize them. But yeah, what do you guys think? Did I say the right thing?